tell you what it is just yet. I'm going to share my screen again and go on to the next item, which I think that you had a sneak view of just now. And the next item, I want you to do exactly the same thing, if this PowerPoint will work for me. There we go. So just take a look at it and then just write your thoughts about that in the chat. Anything, again, just first words. I'll stop sharing. Victorian, Great War, great stuff, yeah. Military, brilliant. World War I popping up a lot, great. Okay, and we're nearly finished with this, but just bear with me. One more item. I want you to do exactly the same thing again because you're really good at it. And I'll see what you think. This third one's a bit more mysterious, although you might know what it is. This one. Snuff box, cigar case, brilliant. Yeah. Great stuff. Okay. That's everyone. Amazing, right. I'll share my screen again because we've got some other pictures, but that's just a little exercise and all will become clear about why I've done that in a minute. Christmas gift for troops, that's a really good one. And you'll see why in a bit. But anyway, amazing, thank you for those answers. So every single one of those words that we've just brainstormed about all of those objects is relevant to each object in its own way. As I say, I'll come back to these objects in a moment, but firstly, what I think is glaringly evident from the exercise that we've just done is that each object has a number of ways that we can interpret it. And I like to think of it as kind of similar to a personality. So just like people have many character traits which reveal themselves at different moments, so do objects have these different sides. And we could categorize them as items from, you know, particular historical eras, but we could equally look at the material that they're made of, as many of you did, or describe them in terms of the functions that they served. So the lens through which we choose to view historic objects has a huge impact on our perception of them, and that shapes our understanding of how they fit into the past. One of the less obvious themes that I think all of these objects share, something that you may have guessed from the title of this talk, I think it gave it away a bit, is empire. For some reason my slides are not moving on. Here we go, right. So when you look at this jumble of objects, I think it's fair to say that the British Empire is not necessarily a topic which, you know, jumps out at you. These objects are all from different eras, they're made from different materials, and they have different functions. So none of them just scream imperialism. Instead, the British Empire forms one of the many layers that these objects are made up of. And it's a layer which is often forgotten or ignored. And revealing this hidden layer is what Elbridge Museum's latest exhibition, Objects of Empire, is all about. Wait, before I get ahead of myself, what do I mean exactly when I talk about the British Empire? I'm sure you've all got a kind of understanding of this, but I'll just outline it. Well, put simply, it was the network of places ruled over or controlled by Britain. And its reach extended to colonies, dominions, territories, and other lands over which Britain had a greater or a lesser degree of control, political control, across the entire globe. And over time, this vast force basically covered India, parts of the Americas, Canada, huge swathes of the African continent, and other small and large land masses. And it dates back, we can trace it, the beginnings of it back as far as the 1400s and 1500s. Because this was the age of discovery, when England and other European powers began to kind of explore the globe and set up trading posts overseas. And of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, these were usually in areas which had precious or exotic goods to bring back home. In terms of its end, although the British Empire no longer exists, its impact can still be felt today in all sorts of places. And just to kind of demonstrate how huge a beast this was, Britain's empire at its height covered around 26% of the Earth's total land mass. I've got a nice map slide to demonstrate that to you. So I think it's shown really well on this map from 1916. This is actually from an object in the exhibition, but I will cover more on that later. So the dark pink that you can see on here was British Empire territory. Yeah, so the dark pink is British Empire territory. This is actually a map from the war. So the key that you can see down the side with our allies, our enemies, Allied territory, etc., is kind of World War I terminology. But all of this area, dark pink area, was controlled by our tiny country over here, which takes up less than 0.1% of the world's landmass. So small that you can barely even make out, its shape on this map. And I think that if you needed proof as to how extraordinary this empire was, I'd argue that, one hardly needs to say or see more than this. So that's the historical context. But despite the fact that Britain's empire was all-encompassing, this, massive international juggernaut, as we've just seen, there's a strong tendency for divide between local and imperial history, almost as if the two represent different spheres which don't touch or overlap. And to understand why that is, I think that we have to look at the depictions of their respective landscapes. So in our collection, we have images of the local area going back centuries. And in this image from the 1750s, you can see the leafy surroundings of Walton Bridge, as I'm sure you recognise, with people sailing on the Thames and out riding their horses, some distinctively British architecture in the background there as well. So a typical country afternoon, I'd say, kind of springs to mind. Then in this image, from a lot later, we can again still see that English architecture. It's really, a traditional parish scene, decidedly villagey, completely made up word there, but I think it sums it up nicely. And then here we've got another picture from our collection. Similar image to the first one. What we can imagine might be high society enjoying themselves in their green surroundings at Claremont in 1754. Deer grazing on rolling hills in the first one, and a stately home thrown into the background there as well, obviously Claremont. It's a very typically English scene. And that's something that I think that we tend to associate with local history a lot. Small villages, small parishes, quite rural and quintessentially English is, one way of viewing it. But then we compare these scenes to scenes from across the empire. So here, it's just an example scene, but we have a depiction of a street scene in British India. And straight away you can see that it's just worlds away from the previous images that we've seen. And likewise, with this image depicting a scene from the American Revolution, a very different style and place again, but you get the idea, the battle, the fighting, the huge army are just worlds away from those peaceful local images, to the extent that it could literally be happening on another planet. And I actually want you to remember that first and third images, so I'll just skip back, those two and that one, the Walton Bridge one, because we will come back to those later. They will reveal themselves in a different light. But just moving on. So, oh, sorry, wasn't supposed to read that. So that's why I think that there's this conflict, this disconnect between what we present as local history and the history of the empire. It's both physically distant and it's visually distant, as you can see in the pictures. And as a result, imperial history has this it's kind of been severed from the local picture. But in reality, of course, the two worlds are connected. And while I was researching for the exhibition, the more I tried to track down evidence of the British Empire in our local history collections, the more I found. And the two are really extremely closely linked through trade, fashion, thoughts, materials, domestic items, local people. You know, the list just goes on and on and on. The evidence is still there in the objects, like we've seen. It's usually overlooked, or it isn't considered to be the main story of the item in question. So it sits in the background a bit in many cases as contextual information, which we don't tend to pay that much attention to. Now, I should say at this point, I'm not an expert on the British Empire by any means. So I'm not going to go into huge, detail on the actual history of the British Empire in this talk. I think it would be pretty impossible to do in, 40 minutes. But I'll start by outlining some of the amazing local objects in our collection and places in our borough which have these connections. And then I'll take a kind of museums approach, looking at the ways that museums can engage with the topic and some of the opportunities and the challenges that we might face while doing so. So starting with the main focus of this talk, the objects themselves. I think I've been going on for long enough about how many objects have different sides to them. So I think it's time we actually looked at some of those in closer detail. Now, this bit is slightly harder thanks to the fact that I haven't been able to access some of our museum stores during lockdown, but I'm hoping that we'll get away with it and the pictures I had already will be clear enough for you. So let's get back to our first three objects. I've made you wait long enough. To shed some light on the matter, the first object is actually a small late Victorian purse. So those of you that said purse, you were right, but I mean, I think it looks kind of accessory, compact kind of thing, so you were on the right lines. Here we have a picture of the inside as well, which has this central purse section made of this dazzling royal blue silk. It's really beautiful, and the back and front of the purse have a beautiful silver design with 4 little silver pins. I'm not sure if you can see there. They're quite small, but they are mounted onto the front to proudly display the owner's initials. And also a silver frame and hinges around the outside. But the bit that I'm really interested in, and which makes this item so relevant to our Objects of Empire theme, is the body of it, the main white body of it. And some of you did get this, but it's made of ivory. And East African ivory became hugely sought after in the late Victorian era. And as a result, we see ivory entering upper class and middle class homes across Britain in the form of fashionable items and knickknacks like this purse. And there are many, many other ivory items in our collection. Just to demonstrate how fashionable it was, here are 2 more from our collection. So on the left, we have a cross necklace made entirely of ivory. And on the right is this beautifully intricate paper fan depicting 3 girls dancing. It was titled, and excuse my terrible accent, it was titled La Danse du Châle. And the ribs of this fan are also made of ivory. They're also both late Victorian, so you can really see how much ivory was used for a real variety of different domestic objects at that time. So thanks to the demand for it, trade in ivory was extremely lucrative and profitable. And the resultant scramble for Africa, as I'm sure many of you have heard, saw European powers basically attempt to expand their empires into a partitioned Africa and gain hold of its valuable resources, which of course included ivory. And so these items are really the products of that time. Moving on to our second object, this lovely mug. So it's maybe a little easier to see with this one what it's all about thanks to the writing on it. So this mug was actually a souvenir given to local school children during the First World War. And I think a lot of you did say First World War, so spot on. I think it's quite clear from the pictures. It's made of white china with portraits in shields in the middle there. On the left of General John French. In the middle, probably one of the most famous faces of the war, Lord Kitchener, and Admiral Jellicoe on the right as we look at it. Now, some of these men themselves were heavily involved in the administration of the British Empire before and after 1914. Lord Kitchener was notable for his role in the Boer War in Africa, as well as campaigns in all sorts of other places across the empire like Egypt, the Middle East, and had posts in British India, so he's a big player. Admiral Jellicoe was also involved in suppressing the anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion in China, and he'd been in the Anglo-Egyptian War. But I'm more interested in the writing on the mug and the overall message that it sends out. So I'm not sure if you can make it out, but on the front, amongst the portraits, it says "For home and empire." And then when you turn the mug around, on the back, it says, "Come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true." Now, anyone that knows their Shakespeare will recognise this as the final line from the final act of Shakespeare's The Life and Death of King John, which was written in 1598. So just bear with me while I go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. You'll see how it all relates. So in the play, the line is spoken by Philip Falconbridge, the illegitimate nephew of King John, and he's a kind of narrator or moral commentator throughout. And he's referring to the Baron's return to allegiance to the new King Henry III after the death of the terrible King John in 1216. I'll actually read the full line out to you because it kind of gives a bit of its context back. So he says, as his final line, "This England never did, nor never shall, lie at the proud foot of a conqueror, but when it first did help to wound itself. Now these her princes are come home again. Come the three corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true." So it's a very optimistic line, which is saying that England is now strong again, and it will never be at risk of being conquered by the three corners of the world, unless there is disunity inside the country. So it's basically saying that as long as we're all loyal to our king and stick together, nothing can break us. And what I like most about Shakespeare is that often you'll find the words are actually, more pointedly written for his audience at the time. So this would have really appealed at the time it was written, since the Elizabethans had just faced the Spanish Armada 10 years before, and there was still a threat hanging over them. You've also, of course, got another, internal conflict going on in 1598, such as the struggle between the Protestant and Catholic faiths, concern over who would succeed Queen Elizabeth as the prospect of her death loomed. So it's attempting to act as a reminder of how much is at stake if subjects don't remain loyal to their ageing queen and the person who would come to succeed her, whoever that might have been. And to bring it back to 1914, the line is serving the same purpose on this mug, basically inspiring patriotism and loyalty to the crown across the empire. And there's a lot of this kind of patriotic imagery kicking around on the outbreak of war in 1914, to the extent that I would argue it becomes ingrained in domestic and local ideas of, what the war was and why we were fighting it. You can see what I'm talking about even more clearly in objects like this certificate, which you can see was issued to schoolboy Alfred Adley in 1916. As a thanks for sending gifts to troops across the empire. Alfred Adley went to a local school in School Road. And I think it takes a similar tone to the mug. You can see it refers to the school children of the empire who sent Christmas gifts to our brave soldiers, and emphasises the freedom of our glorious empire. So it's promoting the supposed unity of the British Empire fighting a common enemy. And the more I looked through our Elbridge Museum system with all our objects on it, the more I found dozens of these little certificates. They're only, very small. They're not as big as they appear on screen. And they're all congratulating children on sending gifts or raising money for troops across the empire, and all using that language of unity and pride in Britain's huge imperial force. Here's another which should be familiar from the start. It's the map I showed you right at the beginning of the talk. So you can see it has a whole variety of imperial troops illustrated around the edges here. And then in this bottom left-hand box, it literally states that the underlying motive of the Overseas Club is to promote the unity of British subjects the world over. Its chief objectives are: 1, to help one another; 2, to render individual service to our empire; 3, to draw together in the bond of comradeship British people the world over; and 4, to maintain our empire's supremacy on the seas and in the air. And perhaps if we're being totally honest, another point, number 5, should be added about expanding the empire, because this was also a key objective during the First World War. It was primarily a war between empires, and the resources of our empire were put to use in order to protect and expand our imperial gains. The historian David Olusoga makes what I think is a really pertinent point about the use of imperial imagery in the First World War years. And he puts it very well in his book, Black and British. So I'm actually just going to quote him because I think he's put it really, really well. He says that in the patriotic mood of 1914, Jamaica's terrible history of slavery, rebellion, and repression was for the moment set aside, and the descendants of the enslaved encouraged to imagine themselves members of an imaginary British Empire of sympathetic paternalism and racial equality. And I think that that's something really important to keep in mind when we see images of empire from the First World War years, because it affects the tone of all of these pieces. And that actually brings us on nicely to our other object, this beautiful tin. So this is a brass-plated tin for Princess Mary's Christmas Fund in 1914. And as you can see from the picture on the right, it contains 2 of the original packets of tobacco and cigarettes. And on the top of the tin, you might be able to make out that there's a central profile portrait of Mary with a laurel wreath and an M embossed on each side of the circle. And the border pattern contains the names Belgium, Japan, Russia, Montenegro, Serbia and France, and beneath the portrait it says Christmas 1914. And I think someone did get this right in their initial words, initial impressions of the object. But above the portrait it says Imperium Britannicum. So the Princess Mary Christmas Fund was distributed to all members of the armed forces of the British Empire on Christmas Day during the First World War again, with this one being saved and clearly treasured, long after the event. So again, the fact that this was sent to troops at the outposts of empire across the globe demonstrates the way that the empire was being used and utilised to unite the people fighting for Britain at this time. These troops abroad are really now included in that unifying attempt that David Olusoga describes. So that's all great, but we could say, how does this relate to local history, our highly localised picture? That I was banging on about at the start of this talk. Well, as we've just seen, these items are linked to the British Empire through their materials, their designs, their usage, their imagery, but they're also all domestic items which would have been found in homes across our borough before making their way into our collection. So even though they're not necessarily unique to our local history alone, they are still a large part of that story and can provide key insights into the ways that the empire permeated the lives, the surroundings, the thoughts of our past local people, both relevant to here and other places, as I say. So this brings us very smoothly onto the exhibition itself. The display will be going into our case at Walton Library. It's not actually up yet, it will be up as of next week. We're putting it in tomorrow, so it'll be available to view from Friday. But obviously any of you that have been to Walton Library will have seen how small the case is. It has 3 main shelves and it's very narrow. This is it here with a different display inside it. I think this was a Georgians display. So this just meant that I had to think a little more carefully about how I went about presenting this topic, particularly given that it can be very delicate and controversial. I didn't want to make any sweeping judgments in the small space. So my main strategy was to promote discussion. I think that that's a key objective for most museums that want to venture into this topic when they haven't before. We ultimately want to encourage people to talk and discuss the contents rather than imposing one rigid interpretation onto them, which can understandably turn people away. So I think that reinterpreting objects, looking at recognised and well understood things from new angles is a great place to start. So what we're trying to do is say, hey, there's other ways that we can view this item which we shouldn't forget about, rather than saying the way that you were viewing these items was wrong and you need to accept this new perspective, which I don't know about you, but that would put me off as a viewer. As I've said, we did this by drawing attention to new details or aspects of the objects, and also incorporating old interpretations into the title descriptions. So, for example, for the Empire Day school certificates that I just showed you earlier, the titles were something like schooling, war, and patriotism. So if you're approaching the display as someone who knows little about the British Empire, it maintains those elements of familiarity in each item. And another way that I tried to promote discussion was to include narrative from authors, public figures, historians, cultural figures throughout the interpretation. And as I've already mentioned, I'm by no means an expert on this history of the British Empire. And I'm also a white middle-class woman who has lived in Britain all my life. And all those factors mean that I don't have the authority to present or interpret this topic solely from my perspective. It wouldn't be a very well-rounded exhibition if I had done. So I kept my input to the object descriptions and the contextual information, and then, widely researched the topic to include opinions, arguments, and also facts from a varied number of writers and speakers. And I think that really adds another dimension to the display. It hopefully encourages viewers to think about where their own opinions sit on the topic by, presenting a variety of thoughts, and it also aims to promote them and prompt them to explore the topic further beyond the small remit of the exhibition, hopefully. So yeah, we've got book lists and things like that, which we've added in. But let's talk about weaknesses. Obviously, one area where there is an unavoidable bias from me is in the objects which were chosen themselves. So having such a small display, as you can see, means that I had to make those tough choices as to what to include and what to leave out. And trust me, this is something I am neither good at nor do I like doing. I would include everything if I had the opportunity. So at Elbridge Museum, we have more than 40,000 items in our collection, and there's just no way that I could have squeezed more than around 20 into the display, while also giving them each item the interpretation it deserved. And believe me, I did try my best to fit in as many as possible. So to some extent, you do have an unconscious bias creeping in there, as the display will only show the best of the collection, the ones that I deem to be the real cream of the crop in terms of the backstories and things like that. And one way that we're going to try and combat this in the future is to have a new kind of pop-up display each year, which will look at a handful of new items in our collection through the lens of Empire, so that we're gradually covering most of the items with imperial links in our collection. But there's no doubt that the way we present objects in displays is a huge issue, and it's something that I was recently discussing with Dr. Alison Smith, who is the chief curator at the National Portrait Gallery. And I was lucky enough to get 30 minutes of Alison's time, where she kind of talked to me about the 2015 Artist and Empire exhibition that she led while she was working as one of the curators at Tate Britain. You might remember it because it was quite a big exhibition, and it's got a book with it as well. You'll soon be able to find the video recording of that interview, my interview with Alison, on our museum website, and it's also on YouTube. And I think I'll send through a link at the end once I finish talking. I'll paste a link into the chat. But I found it really interesting when she told me that her exhibition had been criticised because it was seen by some to celebrate Empire. And I thought, how could it do that? It's so strange. But when you think about it, there is actually a really strong argument there. Displaying objects behind glass, or paintings in a beautifully presented gallery, or items under a spotlight which people come and admire, really does put them centre stage. And that method of display, which unfortunately we have to adhere to for the sake of the preservation of the objects, and it's almost asking for them to be appreciated and admired for the way that they look. And I think that can also separate them from our reality. So that physical barrier of the display case glass or the rope cordon or whatever it is that's, you know, stopping us from interacting with that object, it's kind of divorcing the object from its context. And to me, it can kind of confine those artifacts and the topic they represent to the past, rather than showing how the history of empire can still be felt everywhere around us in our everyday lives. And that kind of brings me nicely onto my next point for this talk, about empire and the local landscape. So I'm going to start this point by taking us back to a couple of images which will be familiar to you. So you might remember these from the start of my talk, when I was demonstrating, you know, how the local landscape may be seen as disconnected from the colonial landscape, thanks to its very different appearance from the classic, you know, Englishness we see here. But these two landscapes are actually far more connected to that imperial past than it may first seem. So let's take the first one, which is, as I say, a print of Walton Bridge from the mid-1700s. And unfortunately, we don't have the details of the artist on our system, but if anyone has an inkling, that would be very welcome. Do let me know at the end. So at the very far right edge of this picture is also the corner of a very grand house peeping out. And that house, as I'm sure you guessed, is what was Mount Felix, sadly a building which doesn't exist anymore. But you can still see the front gates actually facing out onto the crossroads, just past Walton Bridge, on the Walton side of Walton Bridge. So in the first half of the 1700s, the Mount Felix estate had come into being, and it was first owned by a man called Samuel Dicker, who was an English politician. And crucially to our story, he had been appointed the councillor of the British Empire's colony of Jamaica in 1738. And he held huge influence in Jamaica, partially due to the fact that he owned a large, I've lost the word, he owned a large plantation, profitable sugar plantation there, which was operated by a workforce of enslaved Africans. And this was the case with many others across the Americas and the Caribbean. And it made him masses and masses and masses of money, which he could use to advance himself back home in Britain, as was, again, the case with many of these other people that own plantations out there. And we'll never be able to trace, you know, exactly how Dicker spent his money that he generated in Jamaica, you know, the exact trail. But we do know that with his vast wealth that he built up, he was quick to establish the first Walton Bridge in 1750, right next to his grand Mount Felix estate. And this would have provided him with an easy route into London over the Thames, where previously there hadn't been one, as well as a steady income, because he now had a right to toll collection on the bridge from other people passing over it. Once again, crucially, he used his own funds to pay for this first bridge structure, and no doubt much of that was generated by his profitable plantation out in Jamaica. So even though this image that we see here is one which appears very English and neutral, it actually depicts a landscape which has already been touched and shaped by British imperialism in a kind of roundabout way. And it's interesting to note that Mount Felix's connection to the empire continued right up to the modern day, actually. In the First World War, it was used as a convalescent hospital for troops from New Zealand, which was then a dominion of the British Empire. And hence we now have New Zealand Avenue in Walton. So having unpacked this image a little more, we move on to the other image which I presented to you earlier. Well, actually two images. This is, of course, Claremont House and Gardens in Esher, probably one of the most prominent stately homes in Elbridge's entire landscape. And again, in the two pictures, I think there's an impression of this classical English, very traditional Georgian style. Certainly on the surface, it doesn't seem to be much to do with the British Empire. Well, let's take a closer look into this story. The gardens of Claremont are now owned by the National Trust, while the house is home to Claremont Fan Court School, But these were once one estate owned by a man called, at one time owned by a man called Lord Robert Clive, who was very prominent, and I'm sure that most of you will have heard of him. And he had bought the Claremont estate in 1768 after the death of the Duke of Newcastle, who had formerly owned it. So you might, it's very vague on this image, but at the bottom of the bigger image here, at the bottom we've got some writing, and very faintly on the left hand side you can see it's talking about the Duke of Newcastle, because this image was drawn at the time that the Duke of Newcastle owned Claremont and lived at Claremont. So although we might look at that today and think it looks pretty incredible, it wasn't enough for Clive. He wanted it grander. So when he got hold of the estate after the death of the Duke of Newcastle, he immediately got hold of the architect, Capability Brown, and got him to undertake a huge project to completely redesign and redevelop the house into the one that we can see today, which is the image on the right. And that project cost him £100,000 of his money. Sounds pretty pricey, but not too bad, you know, for a house that size. You know, it's a lot, but, you know, not outside of the realms of possibility. Until you realise that that today is a stonking £16,988,706.88 in today's money. So this is absolutely eye-watering amounts that we are talking about here, which kind of leaves you asking, how did Clive get all that money? Well, as you might have guessed, it has a lot to do with his activities in the British Empire, British India to be precise. Clive was an extremely prominent nabob of the British East India Company, and he was actually one of the most controversial figures of his day. He was responsible for the capture of huge swathes of India, and the suppression of populations there, including most notably Bengal, which earned him the title of first governor of the Bengal presidency. And that earned him masses and masses of money. He was, however, actually a really controversial figure during his day as well as today. And a parliamentary inquiry into his actions, which started in 1772, came to some very, very damning conclusions about Clive's practices in India. And he actually took his own life just 2 years after the start of that inquiry in 1774, so he never actually got a chance to live at the finished property. But I think that the result that we can see in these pictures is really a testament to that imperial wealth he gained. So we've kind of dissected both of those pictures and uncovered 2 links to empire in Elbridge's landscape, but what about a bit closer to home, nearer Molesey? Well, there was actually one really significant location which stood out to me, and this wasn't quite in Molesey, it was in Thames Ditton. So this picture from our collection was taken in the 1950s, but I'm sure most of you might recognise it. Perhaps you've even walked or driven past this place. It's very, very close to Molesey. The house is at the top of Thames Ditton High Street. And nowadays you can see a blue plaque on the outside of this house, which gives a hint about, you know, its former inhabitant and who was linked to the British Empire. So the house was formerly known as Picton House, which is a bit of a clue, and the owner was called Caesar Picton, and he was born in 1755, but not in Britain, in Senegal. When Caesar was just 6 years old, he was captured and he was enslaved, and in 1761, so immediately after being, you know, captured and enslaved, Caesar is still a child at this point. He was bought as a present for Sir John Phillips, who was a member of Parliament, who lived at Norbiton Place near Kingston. And that's where Caesar's life in England begins. And although Caesar wasn't treated the same as, you know, the kind of view that we have of enslaved people in the Americas on plantations, he was still seen as property, and he was forced to work as a page boy. So now, this was sadly a fairly common practice among the white British upper classes at this time, despite, you know, the general impressions that you might have, because at this point, the legal status of enslaved people brought to England was still pretty unclear, and it remained pretty unclear until 1772, when it was officially kind of ruled against for the first time. But until then, this kind of thing was quite common, and it was fashionable actually among the British upper classes, and you could find slaves in Britain in households which had, you know, chosen to loosely interpret the fairly fuzzy rules or exploit those, you know, loopholes in the law. So it's actually something that is way more common in this part of the country than you might expect. And any of you who have been to Ham House in Ham, just outside of Richmond, might recognise it again in one of the paintings there. So this is the painting which sits very prominently in Ham House, and it depicts one of the members of the affluent Murray family who own the house, sitting with a black page boy in the background. And you can see he's dressed up very exotically and with a kind of parrot, or I'm not quite sure what that bird is, but some kind of exotic bird. And that would have been to kind of show off the lady's foreign possession, which she'd acquired from abroad, and also perhaps the wealth of the family, the wealth that the family had made in the empire. Again, just as a side note, I think it's interesting, but this painting isn't highlighted more in the property. I used to volunteer as a room guide at Ham House, and I was approached a number of times in the course of my time there about this painting, but certainly to my impression, there never used to be any signage or, you know, explanation of the painting in the volunteer handbook, and I never really looked into it in more detail. And in fact, it was only when I read David Olusoga's book that I found out why the boy must have been there. And I think that this painting helps us to understand the kind of role that Caesar would have fulfilled when he arrived at Norbiton Place. On the eventual death of Lord and Lady Phillips, Caesar used his legacy of £100 that they'd left him to claim his freedom and to become a successful coal merchant. And he took on the surname Picton from the Phillips family, from their coal mining estate of the same name in Pembrokeshire. And during his life as a free man, he initially occupied number 52 High Street in Kingston. I think that there's a blue plaque there as well, but this property backs onto the River Thames. And it was where Picton conducted most of his business while he was younger. And eventually, after amassing quite a healthy fortune, Caesar settled at the house that we've just seen, this house, in Thames Ditton, buying it for £4,000, which is a really, you know, quite a substantial sum back in those days. And it was here that he lived out his final days and also died here in 1836. So really in the heart of Elbridge, and, you know, just a stone's throw from Molesey, Caesar Picton's story, I think, reflects Britain's exploitation of its expanding empire to become quite heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So to me, this is the best part of the Objects of Empire project at Elbridge Museum, because it shows how our current landscape that we, you know, live in, that we work in, and just generally, you know, walk past and use every day, is still connected to the empire. You know, the remains are still there to be seen for the most part, and you know, discovered, rather than lying in the store for half of the year. And that's why an important part of this project for me was making an Elbridge and Empire trail around the borough, revealing new aspects to the history of certain places in the borough. And again, it's going to be available in a leaflet form soon from our website, but for now you can access it online in the form of an audio trail. So each point along the route has a map, pictures, and a short explanation about how it's connected to Empire. And I'll post the link to that again in the meeting chat after I've finished, so that you can see it and have a look, see what you think. And it's also, I should mention, in the form of an audio trail, so you can also listen to each stop as you go through. It's more of a driving trail, because it's quite a long one. So there you go. To me, this is what local history is all about, this kind of going around the local area, actually showing the history which is on the front doorstep, and which you don't need a display cabinet or a gallery space to access. You know, there's an incredible power to be able to say, this took place where you're standing, or this took place down the road from where you live. So it had a real, you know, I really enjoyed researching this bit. So just to conclude, I hope that some of the historic objects and places that I've outlined for you in this talk have been of interest. and help to shed some light on this massive topic in our local area. And I wish I could talk about more of the objects, but I'm afraid I'll probably have you here till probably tomorrow morning. A display on Empire is never going to be perfect or cover all of the bases, but I think it is important that we start doing this kind of thing more in public history, and it really can open up a dialogue about our imperial history. The fact that even professional historians disagree on the topic, combined with its challenging and very delicate nature, in the past I think has sometimes rendered it difficult to engage with, and it's easy to feel frozen out of that ongoing debate due to how sensitive it can be and how passionate I think people can get over it. So to me, any and all of your comments are welcome, whether it's to criticise the exhibition, to agree with it, to ask questions about it, because crucially, all of these things mean that people are talking about it. And I think that has been a tendency in this country, as I'm sure you'll be aware from recent months in the news, to view Britain's empire through a kind of nostalgic, rose-tinted spectacles. And I think lots of museums and public institutions, the National Trust being one of the main ones, are really just waking up to the fact that this isn't enough anymore. Instead, we need a really honest, fair approach, which scrutinises our imperial history rather than, airbrushing it. And many museums are in a position to do that. And funnily enough, I actually had, planned this Objects of Empire exhibition into Elbridge Museum's schedule right back when I first started my job in August 2019. It's something that I've really wanted to do for a while, because I think it's a really underappreciated topic. But I think that the recent, protests and calls for change have made it more relevant than ever at the moment, and it really cemented my reasons for wanting to undertake the project. By looking at the objects and places through a new lens, I'm not trying to tell anyone that they've been looking at history wrong. I'm not even sure if that's possible, to be honest. But by adding some previously forgotten perspectives, I'd hope that we're aiding that vital first step towards making this part of our history accessible to everyone, and in some ways enabling a more informed discussion about the British Empire's impact at every level of society. So I will end there. Thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen and I would be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating.
Great, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
More than I expected to be honest. I thought I'll see how it went. No, it was really interesting. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Particularly interesting is the Great War stuff you did. Is that jingoism or patriotism? Is that fine balance? Yeah. Looking at it, it's probably more jingoism, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. We've got so much in our collection from the First World War. There was like a wealth. I realised that I spent quite a long time on the First World War, but there's so much from that era. And I think it's a time when something that I actually didn't mention is also kind of at that point, you have a really interesting parallel with, I'll just show you the mug. I think I've got a picture of it here, actually. I'll just show it to you quickly.
Beginning of the end of the British Empire anyway.
Yeah, so as well as the war and all of that we're saying about, you've got a kind of royalty is needing more as you progress into the 20th century. Royalty kind of needs something to put it quite crudely, just back it up, and kind of nationalism, and empire is kind of used and associated with royalty a lot, and they kind of express their support for it a lot, and those titles, Emperor of India, Empress of India, come into being a lot more. I think it's really interesting listening to George V, I think it is, Jubilee speech. He talks a lot about empire and Victoria and carrying on. So I think that as well as the war, it starts to become something that really backs up royalty, and we can see that a lot in our collection. I might just share my screen quickly with you because we have this this is something that is actually on display, going on display in our collection, from our collection, and I've also put a little bit about it online. And there's a really great quote from one of the authors that I use that talks about, on the back of this, there's stuff on it which describes George V's status as the Emperor of India, and there's a really good commentary from one of the authors that I used about the symbolism of that. So I definitely recommend giving it a look.
So are there any places on the trail that are in Molesey, Amy?
I don't think there are any actually in Molesey, which is, yeah, I was trying to get as close to Molesey as possible, but I didn't actually find anything in Molesey itself. But that might be something that I can, you know, work on and add. I kind of tried to do like a little circle around the whole borough, but it kind of didn't quite reach Molesey.
Maybe it's a challenge for us to find something for you that isn't.
Yeah, I mean, anything would be welcome, really, it would. I'm sure there is a lot. I mean, something that you do have, which I guess is, I mean, it's over the bridge, but Hampton Court Palace, that I've talked about a little bit in the online exhibition and in the trail, is the Tudors, and the fact that empire really doesn't start in the Tudor period, but you have the beginnings of what will become an empire and exploring those international relationships. Queen Elizabeth II is very, very keen on entering into alliance with the King of Morocco, because it kind of counteracts the threat from Catholic Spain at that time. And it's something that we don't really hear about that much, that I certainly didn't learn about at school, something I only really looked at in my degree. So yeah, it's really interesting that you have developing relationships then, and exploration begins, and obviously the beginnings of the slave trade, which is initially funded by the crown, the Elizabethan crown. So
hi there, Amy.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Yeah, it's been a long while.
Yeah. For everyone else in the room, this is because I've been an Elbridge Museum volunteer until lockdown. There was the Prince Regent, George IV, had a drinking buddy called Admiral Sir Edmund Nagle, and he died in Molesey in 1830, and in a house that we haven't located yet, but somewhere in Bridge Road, I guess. And in his will, he left 100 slaves. So I think I might try and follow that up as a connection. Yeah,
definitely.
But
wow, I had no idea about that.
No, well, I can't sort of pin it down at the moment for you, but yeah, we'll try and find some other connections, because in West Molesey particularly, we had lots of big houses. I mean, the land's all been parcelled up and turned into residential suburbs for London now, but those big houses, I wouldn't mind betting that they were bought with money from proceeds made in empire. Somebody did anyway, so we'll look into it for you. As Jenny said, we'll try and find out. But I wanted to thank you for yes, it's a really controversial issue, and I think you trod in between very well. And it reminded me that Chou En-lai, when he was asked what the significance of the French Revolution was, he said in 1972, he said it's too soon to tell yet. And what I like about what's happening over our imperial history is, we are reappraising it, and there will be no definitive answer for a long while. But to get to a question, what's your impression about the sorts of things that the museum has collected and about empire? And are there any gaps? Is there anything that you looked for that you couldn't find because nobody had thought to donate it to the museum or preserve it?
It's a really good question. I wish there was something that I could say, oh, I really wanted to find this and I couldn't. I mean, obviously, how long is a piece of string? I'd welcome anything on empire. Even though we've got a lot of stuff, I'd always welcome more. But there was nothing that I really felt, oh, I wish we had something like that, because most of the links that I found were in domestic items. So they're ones which it's a case of looking at the, when I started researching this project, they basically have a system where you can search certain terms, and when you search empire, barely anything comes up on our system because everything is categorized under different titles. And that's part of the reason that I really wanted to do this topic from when I started, is that I was kind of playing around with the system and saw that, there's all sorts of things which have ivory in them or are made of, calico. We've got silk parasols as well, like the things I've shown you that refer to empire in the titles, Jubilee stuff, which talks about Emperor of India, etc., etc. But none of that is categorized under the topic of, this is a imperial item, this is something that's related to the British Empire. So it's not really a case of, is there anything that I really want to find in our collection? It's more like discovering those links and looking, just making my way through each item and just kind of trying to say, how can we look at this in a different light where we reveal its links to empire? So I think it's just a case of plodding on through all of that collection. I'm sure there's even more in there now. I've not got a definitive list now. There's more to be discovered that I had no idea about, just like you've just told me about, the Molesey links to empire. So I'm sure there is plenty more in there.
How long have you been working on this exhibition?
Oh, well, I planned it from when I started at Elbridge, and then I started working on it probably later than I should have done, kind of April, maybe May.
So you've had to do it all during lockdown?
Yes, yeah, all during lockdown. So I think I could, the potential to how much I could have found if I'd had access to the stores, I mean, I'd probably still be there now, to be honest. But it's probably a good thing, actually, because, it gave me limitations. I could only use the things on our system, which for anyone that isn't familiar with our system, we have everything in our collection listed on the system, but we don't have pictures of everything on the system. So there are only some items which have pictures, high quality images like I showed you, on the system. So I normally have to go to the store and take pictures of things, look at the descriptions and say, oh, that looks interesting, I'll go and have a look at that. And I haven't been able to do that in this case. I've had to pick things where I know exactly what they are. So the potential is probably huge for this topic, which is why, we're only just getting started. There's going to be more next year and the year after that. So hopefully it will have a really good ongoing legacy.
And what exhibitions are you planning in the future?
Right, so we've got Empire coming up at Walton. We've got a horse racing exhibition coming up at Thames Ditton, which looks at Hurst Park and Sandown. So that will be in at Ditton's Library as of early October. I'm not sure if Ditton's Library is actually open at the moment. It will probably be opening soon, but yeah, that's coming up. And then we will be doing our Changing High Streets exhibition. So this will be a bit of a bigger one online, and it will look at various high streets throughout the borough. I think I'm going to take each kind of main high street that we have. So Weybridge, Walton, Molesey, all of them. And just, it's going to be a bit like the Elbridge at War thing that we did, where we're getting people to contribute, their stories, their any old artifacts they have. Just, we have a lot of items in our collection which are from old shops that used to exist on the high street and things like that. So just looking at a kind of then and now approach, which I think will be really nice because it's very, very local and it's something that we've not done for a while.
That'd be quite nice. It'd be quite nice to have a talk on that. Because it'd be quite visual, wouldn't it?
Well, watch this space. I've yet to research, but give me a few months and I'll be back.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? No, well, thank you very much, Amy. I really enjoyed that.
All right. I'm glad. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me and for listening and giving up your evenings.
Good for getting us involved. Yes, thank you. And hopefully you'll come and talk to us again sometime.
Definitely, yeah, if you have me. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you very much for listening and giving up your evenings to listen. Do very much appreciate it. Because we're a very small museum, so I might actually send through those links to the things that I was talking about to you, Jenny, or Anthony, or someone, and maybe you can like distribute them to, you know, in a newsletter or anything like that, if people have an interest, so that you can see what I was talking about.
If you send them through, then I'll make sure they get sent out.
Great.
So that's probably the easiest
Thank you.
way of dealing with it, I think.
Yeah.